The loud warning sirens rang through the glass-like hallways of the biggest space station in the galaxy. Commander Lee Hanna was sitting at her desk when her computer screen suddenly filled with urgent red messages. Her coffee cup shook slightly, as more and more distress signals poured in from the outer edges of known space. 3 colonies completely gone, she whispered to herself, reading the terrifying reports. The last messages from those distant worlds showed something that made her blood run cold. Huge black creatures, bigger than entire cities, were eating everything in their path. Stars, planets, space stations, nothing was left behind. These weren't just any monsters. The old records called them devourers, ancient beings that had been sleeping for over 1,000,000 years. Now they were awake and hungry. Lee Hanna quickly called for an emergency meeting. Within hours, representatives from dozens of alien species gathered in the council's main chamber. The room buzzed with nervous energy as holographic displays showed the destruction spreading across the galaxy like a deadly plague. Vexel, a tall crystal-like being from the Zephyrian homeworld, was shaking so hard that his body made tiny, ringing sounds. His people were known for being calm and logical, but even he couldn't hide his fear. "Our most powerful shields mean nothing to them," he said, his voice cracking. "These creatures actually eat energy. Every weapon we fire at them just makes them stronger." The other alien representatives looked just as scared. The nebuloids, who looked like floating clouds of gas, were changing colors rapidly, a sign of extreme stress. The rock-like rock forms were making low rumbling sounds, which meant they were terrified. These were some of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, and they all felt completely helpless. "What do we do?" asked a small, furry creature from the Whisker Coalition. "If our best technology can't stop them, how can we possibly survive?" The room filled with panicked voices as different species suggested wild escape plans. Some wanted to evacuate entire star systems. Others thought they should hide in distant galaxies. A few even suggested surrendering and hoping the Devourers would show mercy. But then someone remembered the newest members of the Galactic Council, the humans from a planet called Terra. Most aliens thought humans were primitive and barely civilized. They came from what the Council classified as a death world, a planet so dangerous that just living there for one day would kill most other species. When Ambassador Kim Gi-won walked into the chamber, the room gradually became quiet. She was small compared to most aliens, wearing a simple dark blue uniform. Her black hair was pulled back neatly, and her brown eyes moved calmly across the displays, showing the approaching doom. While everyone else was running around in panic, Kim Ji-won just stood there, reading the data like she was looking at a weather report. She didn't scream, didn't shake, didn't even look worried. She just studied the tactical information with the same expression someone might use while planning their grocery shopping. The other aliens found her calmness almost more frightening than the Devourers themselves. The nebuloid delegate's gaseous form turned a bright orange color, which meant he was completely shocked. His voice came out as a high-pitched whistle. "Wait, did you just say you want to fight these things? The same creatures that just destroyed 3 entire star systems?" Kim Gi-won nodded like she had just suggested having lunch. "That's right. We fight them." The whole chamber erupted in chaos. Aliens were making all kinds of noises, screeching, buzzing, rumbling, and clicking. Some were changing colors rapidly, others were floating around in circles, and a few were hitting their heads against the walls. "Are you insane?" shouted a Zephyrian council member, his crystal body flashing red with anger. "These beings are older than most civilizations. They've destroyed everything in their path for millions of years." But Captain Park Min-ho stepped up next to the ambassador. He was a stocky man with several scars running across his face and hands. His uniform was plain and practical, nothing fancy like the shimmering robes the other species wore. When he spoke, his voice was calm and steady. "We'll need some information first," he said, pulling out a simple tablet device. Can you give us data on your industrial manufacturing? We need to know what factories you have, where they are, and what they can produce." The alien stared at him like he had grown a second head. "Also," Park Min-ho continued, "we need population numbers for each world, supply chain information, and detailed maps of all your shipping routes." A tall, elderly rock form, basically a walking mountain of living stone, made a sound like grinding rocks. This was their version of laughter, but not the good kind. "You primitive mammals don't understand. We're talking about beings that can walk through solid matter like it's air. They eat energy itself. Your crude metal bullets and explosive chemicals are useless against them." The other aliens nodded in agreement. To them, humans were barely out of the Stone Age, while alien civilizations used quantum physics and manipulation of reality itself. Humans still used things that went boom and threw heavy objects at their enemies really fast, but instead of getting angry or defensive, Kim Gi-won actually smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made smart people take a step backward. "You know what?" she said, her voice still perfectly calm. "You're probably right. Our weapons are simple. We use kinetic energy, chemical explosives, and nuclear fusion. Very basic stuff compared to your quantum manipulators and reality distortion fields." The aliens looked smug, thinking she was finally admitting defeat. "But here's the thing," Kim Ji-won continued, that cold smile getting wider. "We're really, really good at making simple things work in situations where complicated things break down. It's kind of our specialty." Captain Park Min-ho nodded. "On Earth, we have a saying, if you can't fix it with duct tape and determination, you're not using enough duct tape." The aliens had no idea what duct tape was, but something about the way the humans said it made them very uncomfortable. Admiral Choi Dae-ho stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching as the stars suddenly appeared around them. The jump through hyperspace always made his stomach feel funny, but after 20 years in the Space Navy, he barely noticed it anymore. What he did notice was what waited for them in this star system. "Holy ... whispered someone behind him, but they caught themselves before finishing the curse dot in front of them. Floating in the empty darkness of space were the Deathworlders. They looked like massive black holes that had somehow learned to move. Each one was bigger than Earth's moon, and they seemed to suck the light right out of the stars around them. Even the distant suns looked dimmer, as if these creatures were drinking their energy from across the solar system. Lieutenant Yoon Sola was reading numbers from her computer screen, and her voice was shaking slightly. "Sir, based on what happened to the alien colonies, we should expect 90% casualties in the first 10 minutes of contact." The bridge went quiet. Everyone knew what that meant. Almost all of them were probably going to die today, but Admiral Choi Dae-ho just nodded, like she had told him the weather forecast. "Understood. What's the status on our weapon systems?" "All kinetic cannons loaded and ready, sir. Nuclear missiles are armed and prepared for launch." Through the communication system, they could hear the alien observer ships talking to each other in panicked voices. The Galactic Council had sent a few ships to watch the battle, though they were staying very far away. "The humans are actually going to fight those things," one alien voice said in disbelief. "They're either the bravest species in the galaxy, or the most stupid." Admiral Choi Dae-ho turned on his communicator. "Attention, all ships. You've all seen what these creatures did to 3 entire star systems. They eat energy, which means every fancy weapon the aliens have just makes them stronger." He paused, looking around at his crew. They were all young men and women who had volunteered for this mission, knowing they might never see home again. "But we're not aliens," he continued. "We're humans. And humans have been throwing rocks at things we don't like since we lived in caves. Today, we're just throwing really, really big rocks, really, really fast." A few people actually chuckled at that, which was exactly what he wanted. The Devourers started moving toward them, probably expecting another easy meal, like they had gotten from the alien worlds. These ancient creatures had been eating civilizations for millions of years, and every species they encountered used the same type of energy-based weapons. "All ships, this is Admiral Choi," he said into his communicator. "Load tungsten rounds. Set nuclear warheads to maximum yield. We're going to show these things what happens when you mess with a species that learned to fight on a planet that tries to kill everything living on it." The first devourer rushed toward them, moving faster than something that big should be able to move. "Fire everything," the Admiral ordered. What happened next was something the devourers had never experienced before. Instead of energy beams they could absorb, they were hit by chunks of metal moving at nearly the speed of light, followed by nuclear explosions that turned the darkness of space into brilliant daylight. For the first time in millions of years, the ancient predators felt pain. Sergeant Ominsu could feel the cold vacuum of space trying to suck him out through the massive hole in his ship's wall. The emergency alarms were screaming, red lights were flashing everywhere, and he could see stars through what used to be the engine room. Most people would have panicked. Most people would have given up. But Ominsu wasn't most people. He was from Earth. He grabbed a canister of emergency foam and started spraying it into the breach. The foam expanded and hardened instantly, creating a temporary seal. His oxygen gauge was flashing red. He had run out of air 3 minutes ago, and was now breathing whatever was left in his helmet. His lungs burned. His vision was getting blurry, but his hands never stopped working. "Just need 30 more seconds," he muttered to himself, even though talking used up precious oxygen. "Come on, you piece of junk, hold together." On the observation deck of a council ship, safely positioned several thousand kilometers away from the battle, alien representatives watched in complete shock. Their advanced sensors were picking up readings that shouldn't be possible. "That human's heart rate should have stopped 2 minutes ago," said a nebuloid medical officer, his gaseous form flickering with confusion. "His blood oxygen levels are at critical low. He should be unconscious by now." But instead of collapsing, Sergeant Ominsu finished sealing the breach and then immediately started working on the damaged power systems. Even without air, even with his body shutting down, he kept fixing things. Across the battlefield, other humans were doing equally impossible things. Commander Bae Yunha was flying her fighter craft with a piece of metal the size of a dinner plate sticking out of her shoulder. Blood was floating in droplets around her cockpit, and her left arm wasn't working properly, but she was still firing weapons with deadly accuracy. "Target acquired," she said into her radio, her voice steady, despite the pain. "I'm going in." Her fighter was badly damaged. The engines were sputtering, half the weapons were offline, and the life support system was making worrying noises. Any sensible pilot would have retreated to a safe distance for repairs. Instead, Commander Bae Yunha aimed her crippled ship directly at the center of the nearest devourer, and pushed the throttle to maximum. "Bae, what are you doing?" came Admiral Choi's voice over the radio. "Something stupid," she replied, then switched off her communicator. The alien observers watched in horror, as the tiny human fighter flew straight into the massive shadow creature. The impact should have been like a mosquito hitting a mountain, but somehow, the devourer actually flinched. The creature's dark form rippled and twisted as the fighter's nuclear self-destruct sequence activated inside its core. A Zephyrian Council member was shaking so hard his crystal body was making music. "This is impossible. According to our medical scanners, that human should have passed out from blood loss 5 minutes ago. How is she still flying?" Ambassador King Ji-won, who was watching the battle from the observation deck, didn't even look surprised. She had a cup of coffee in her hands and was sipping it calmly, while humans threw themselves at ancient cosmic horrors. "You have to understand something about my people," she said, her voice as casual as if she was discussing the weather. "Earth isn't a nice place to live. It's a planet that spent millions of years trying to kill everything on it. Ice ages, volcanic explosions, asteroid impacts, Deadly animals, poisonous plants, extreme weather, you name it. She took another sip of coffee while on the screens behind her, more human fighters were ramming themselves into devourers. We learned a very important lesson early on, Kim Gi-won continued. On Earth, if you give up, you die. If you panic, you die. If you stop fighting, you die. So we evolved to never stop fighting, no matter what. Fleet Admiral Zheng Wusung stood in the command center of humanity's largest warship, surrounded by dozens of screens showing the battle from every angle. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he barely noticed. Right now, he was orchestrating the most insane military operation in galactic history. Status report. He called out to his communications officer. Sir, Strike Group Alpha has successfully destabilized the Red Giant in Sector 7. The star will collapse in approximately 4 hours, cutting off the Devourer's main energy source in that region. The alien observers listening in on human communications couldn't believe what they were hearing. These humans were literally blowing up stars as part of their battle plan. To most civilizations, stars were sacred things to be protected and preserved. To humans, they were apparently just really big weapons. Good, Admiral Zheng replied. What about the boarding operations? Major Shin Haijin reports successful penetration of the primary devourer in Sector 12. Her teams are fighting inside the creature now. If the aliens thought blowing up stars was crazy, the idea of sending soldiers to fight inside the devourers themselves was completely beyond their understanding. It was like watching someone decide to cure a headache by performing brain surgery on themselves with a hammer. Major Shin Haijin was leading her assault team through what could only be described as the inside of a nightmare. The interior of the devourer was like walking through liquid shadow that somehow held its shape. Her armor was sparking and making alarming beeping sounds as the creature's energy field tried to drain its power. Keep moving, she shouted to her soldiers. Don't let this thing get used to our energy signatures. Her armor looked like a bulky metal suit compared to the sleek, glowing equipment the aliens used. It was heavy, loud, and had roughly the same technological elegance as a construction vehicle. But while alien equipment failed completely inside the devourers, the human armor kept working. Ma'am, my disruption rifle is overheating, called out Corporal Lee Dongmin. Then use your backup weapon, Major Shin replied. What backup weapon? She held up her armored fist. These. The alien observers watching through remote cameras couldn't process what they were seeing. Human soldiers were literally punching creatures made of pure energy, and somehow it was working. This makes no sense, whispered a rock-form military expert. They're using their appendages to strike beings composed of dark matter and exotic particles. The physics alone should make this impossible. Look at how they move, added a Zephyrian tactician. There's no elegance, no precision. They're just hitting things until they break. Captain Nam Ji-ho, who was coordinating supply drops to the boarding teams, heard the alien comments over the open communication channel. You want to know why we fight like this? He said, his voice cutting through the chatter. Because we're not trying to win some beautiful, artistic war. We're not here to show off how advanced our technology is. His ship shook as another nuclear warhead detonated nearby, clearing a path for more boarding pods. We're here to build something, Captain Nam continued. Every star we collapse, every boarding action, every soldier we send into those things, it's all construction work. We're building a galaxy where kids can grow up without worrying about ancient monsters eating their planets. On the main screen, they could see human soldiers working inside the Devourer like they were renovating a house. They placed explosive charges, rewired energy conduits, and systematically dismantled the creature from the inside out. You call it brutal and primitive, Nam Ji-ho said. We call it effective. And at the end of the day, effective is what keeps people alive. The battle had been going on for 18 hours straight, and the human fleet was paying a terrible price. Colonel Quan Taean looked at his tactical display and felt his heart sink. Half of his squadron was gone, and the rest of his ships were running low on ammunition and fuel. But behind them, dozens of civilian transport ships were still trying to escape to safety. "Colonel, we've got another wave of Devourers coming in from the east," reported his communications officer. "At least 20 of them, and they're moving fast." Quan Taean looked at his remaining pilots. There were only 12 fighters left out of the 50 they had started with. The math was simple and brutal. They couldn't win this fight. "All civilian vessels, this is Colonel Quan," he said into his microphone. "You need to jump to hyperspace now. We'll buy you as much time as we can." His voice was completely calm, like he was giving directions to the grocery store instead of preparing to die. But everyone listening knew what he was really saying. His squadron was going to sacrifice themselves so the civilian ships could escape. Inside the transport vessels, families were crowded together in cargo holds and passenger compartments. Most of them were aliens who had never seen humans before this crisis. Now they were watching these strange Deathworlders throw their lives away to save people they didn't even know. Through the quantum communication system, they could hear human soldiers calling their families back on Earth. "Mom, I want you to know I'm proud to be your son," said a young pilot, whose voice cracked slightly. "Take care of little sister for me, okay?" An older soldier was talking to his wife. "Tell the kids that Daddy loves them very much. And honey, don't be sad. We're doing something important here." The aliens listening to these conversations were crying, or doing whatever their species did when they were deeply moved. These humans were facing certain death, but instead of being angry or scared, they were saying goodbye with love and dignity. Meanwhile, deep inside a damaged research ship, Dr. Lim Yemen was working frantically in his laboratory. The lights kept flickering on and off, and he could hear the hull groaning under stress. Half of his equipment was broken, and there were several holes in the walls that had been patched with emergency foam. "Dr. Lim," shouted his assistant from the doorway. "The captain says we have 5 minutes before the ship breaks apart. We need to get to the escape pods now." But Dr. Lim Yemen didn't even look up from his microscope. His hands were moving quickly as he analyzed samples from the Devourers, looking for anything that might help the fleet defeat them. "Just give me 5 more minutes," he called back. "I think I've found something important." "Sir, the ship is literally falling apart around us." "Then help me save this data instead of arguing," Dr. Lim snapped. "If I'm right about this, it could save millions of lives." Around him, his research team faced a choice. They could run to safety, or they could stay and help their stubborn colleague finish his work. One by one, they chose to stay. Outside, Colonel Quan Taean's fighters were engaging the Devourers in what everyone knew would be their final battle. But they fought with the same determination as always, because someone had to buy time for the people trying to escape. "This is why we do this," one pilot said over the radio as his ship took heavy damage. "Not for glory, not for medals. Just so other people get to go home tonight." Dr. Lim Yemen was hunched over his computer when the breakthrough finally came. His research ship was shaking apart around him. Metal beams were falling from the ceiling. Sparks were flying from broken electrical systems, and he could hear the horrible sound of the hull cracking under pressure. But none of that mattered anymore, because what he was seeing on his screen changed everything. "Oh my God," he whispered, staring at the data. "They're not hunters at all." His hands flew across the keyboard as he compiled his findings. The Dev weren't ancient predators who enjoyed destroying civilizations. They were running away from something. Deep in the dark spaces between galaxies, something so terrible existed that even these massive creatures were fleeing from it in pure terror. "Dr. Lim, we need to evacuate right now," his assistant shouted from across the collapsing laboratory. "The ship's reactor is about to explode. Send this data to Admiral Choi immediately." Dr. Lim yelled back, frantically uploading his research to the communication system. The floor beneath his feet was tilting at a dangerous angle, and he could see stars through a crack that was growing larger by the second. As his ship finally broke apart around him, Dr. Lim managed to get through to the Admiral's flagship. His voice was barely audible over the sound of his ship dying. "Admiral, you need to listen to me," he gasped, holding on to his communication device as pieces of his laboratory floated away into space. "We don't need to destroy them. We need to redirect them. The Devourers are refugees, not invaders. They're running away from something even worse." The communication cut out as Dr. Lim's ship finally exploded, taking one of humanity's brightest scientists with it. But his sacrifice wasn't in vain. His data had made it through. Chief Engineer An Sungmin received the research data and immediately understood what needed to be done. He called his engineering team together and showed them Dr. Lim's plans for massive gravitational redirector devices, machines that could create artificial gravity fields strong enough to guide the Devourers away from populated space. "This could work," he said, studying the blueprints. "But there's a problem. These devices need to be calibrated manually, and they have to be placed right in the path of the Devourers." His assistant, Song Min Jung, looked at the radiation readings and went pale. "Sir, the energy fields around those creatures would kill any living being in seconds. Even our best protective suits wouldn't help." An Sungmin was quiet for a moment, then he shrugged. "Well, it's a good thing we're humans then. We specialize in doing things that should be impossible." Within 6 hours, the engineering teams had built the first gravitational redirectors. They were massive machines, each one the size of a small building, and they needed to be positioned at specific points around the Devourer swarms. When Admiral Choi announced that they needed volunteers for the mission, the response was overwhelming. Thousands of humans stepped forward, knowing that operating these machines would mean certain death from radiation exposure. The alien observers couldn't believe what they were seeing. Young men and women, some barely out of their teens, were volunteering for suicide missions to save civilizations they had never heard of. "Why are they doing this?" asked a Zephyrian council member, his crystal form flickering with confusion. "These aren't even their worlds we're trying to save." A human communications officer heard the question and answered simply, "Because if we don't, who will? Someone has to stand between the monsters and the people who can't fight them. That's what humans do." The moment of truth had arrived. Captain Cha Yuna sat in the pilot's seat of her small fighter craft, staring at the massive devourer that filled her entire view screen. This wasn't just any creature. This was the leader of the swarm, bigger than most moons, and darker than the empty space between stars. Her job was to fly straight into its center and plant the final redirector beacon that would guide all the Devourers away from populated space. "Captain, I'm reading radiation levels that are literally breaking our measuring equipment," said her co-pilot, Han Dong. His voice was calm, but she could see sweat dripping down his face. "Our ship's shielding will fail in about 3 minutes. After that, we'll have maybe 30 seconds before the radiation kills us." Captain Cha Yuna checked her instruments one more time. Everything was working perfectly, which was good because they would only get one chance at this. "Then I guess we better not waste any time," she said, pushing the throttle forward. "Hold on, Donggu. This is going to be a rough ride." Their fighters shot forward like a bullet, heading straight for the heart of the creature. The Devourer seemed to notice them coming. Its massive form shifted and twisted, trying to swat them away like annoying insects. But Captain Cha Yuna had been flying since she was 16 years old, and she knew how to make a small ship dance through impossible situations. Behind them, all across the galaxy, other human volunteers were doing their part. At dozens of locations, the gravitational redirector arrays were powering up, but these massive machines needed constant adjustment, and the only way to calibrate them properly was by hand. Private Kim Jung-kwan was one of hundreds of volunteers working at the redirector stations. He wore a radiation suit that was supposed to protect him, but everyone knew it wouldn't be enough. The energy fields around these machines were so intense that they could cook a person from the inside out in minutes. Redirector 7 needs adjustment, shouted his supervisor over the communication system. We need someone to manually calibrate the gravity field generator. I'll do it, Kim Jong-won said, already running toward the machine. He knew that touching the controls would expose him to lethal radiation, but the alternative was letting the Devourers destroy entire star systems. He worked quickly, his hands dancing over the controls as the machine hummed with dangerous energy. Within minutes, he could feel his body starting to shut down. His vision became blurry, his hands started shaking, and he could taste blood in his mouth. But he kept working until the job was done. When his heart finally stopped, another volunteer immediately took his place. This scene was playing out at redirector stations all across the galaxy. Humans would work until the radiation killed them. Then other humans would step over their bodies and continue the work. It was like a relay race, where every runner knew they wouldn't survive to pass the baton. The alien observers watching this unfold couldn't understand it. In their civilizations, individuals were expected to preserve their own lives above all. Else the idea of willingly dying for strangers was completely foreign to them. Why do they keep volunteering? Asked a Nebuloid council member. They know it's certain death. An old Zephyrian military advisor who had been watching the humans fight answered, quietly, because they understand something we forgot long ago. Sometimes the only way to save everyone is for someone to be willing to lose everything. Captain Chayuna's ship finally penetrated the Devourer's outer defenses. Beacon deployment in 10 seconds. She called out, even though she knew no one could hear her anymore. Her communication system had failed minutes ago. It's been an honor flying with you, she said to Han Dongwu. Likewise, Captain, he replied, reaching over to help her trigger the beacon. Together, they activated the device that would save the galaxy. It worked. Against all odds, against logic, against everything the galaxy's greatest minds thought was possible. The human plan actually worked. The massive gravitational redirectors hummed with power across dozens of star systems, creating invisible highways that guided the Devourers away from populated space. The ancient creatures, following the artificial gravity wells like rivers flowing downhill, began streaming toward the empty void between galaxies. For the first time in millions of years, they were moving away from civilization instead of toward it. On the observation deck of the Council's flagship, alien representatives watched in stunned silence as the threat that had terrified them for weeks simply ... left. The Devourers disappeared into the darkness beyond the galaxy's edge, following paths that would take them far away from any inhabited worlds. But the celebration was muted as reports came in from across the human fleet. The true cost of victory became clear. Admiral Choi Dehos' voice was heavy as he read the casualty reports over the communication system. Final tally, we've lost 37% of our ships, including most of our heavy cruisers. Personnel losses are significant. We estimate over 200,000 volunteers gave their lives operating the redirector arrays. The numbers were staggering. Entire families had been wiped out. Some ships had lost their entire crews. There were human colonies that had sent every single adult to help with the mission, leaving only children and elderly people behind. Ambassador Kim Gi-won stood in the council chambers 3 days later, wearing a black dress uniform covered with small pins. Each pin represented a different human ship or unit that had been lost in the battle. There were so many pins that they covered most of her chest. The council chamber was fuller than it had ever been. Representatives from every member species had come to witness this moment, along with delegates from dozens of worlds that had been saved from the Devourers. The Zephyrian High Counselor, his crystal form glowing with a soft blue light, spoke first. Ambassador Kim Ji-won, we owe humanity a debt that can never be repaid. But we must ask, why did your people sacrifice so much for species that had barely accepted you as members? Many of us questioned whether humans even belonged in this council. Kim Gi-won was quiet for a long moment, looking out at all the alien faces staring at her. Some were curious, some were grateful, and a few still looked suspicious of these strange Deathworlders. "You want to know why we did it?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "It's not complicated. We did it because that's what people do when other people are in trouble. We help." A rock-formed delegate made a rumbling sound of confusion. "But the cost was enormous. You lost so many of your own kind." "Yes, we did," Kim Ji-won replied, "and every single one of them knew the risks before they volunteered. But they also knew that if we didn't act, billions of innocent beings would die. Children who would never grow up, families that would be torn apart, entire civilizations that would be erased from history." She paused, touching one of the pins on her uniform, the one representing Captain Cha Yuna's sacrifice. "On Earth, we have a saying, we are only as strong as our weakest member. That doesn't just apply to humans. It applies to everyone. The galaxy is our neighborhood now, and when the neighborhood is in danger, you don't ask who deserves to be saved. You just save everyone you can." The High Counselor's form brightened. "Then let it be recorded that humanity is no longer a probationary member of this council. You are hereby designated as the Galactic Protectorate, with full authority to defend this galaxy against any threat." As the formal ceremony concluded, a young nebuloid approached Ambassador Kim Gi-won. "I still don't understand," the alien said. "How did you know your plan would work? How did you know your people would be willing to die for strangers?" Kim Ji-won smiled sadly. "Because we come from a world that spent millions of years trying to kill us. We learned that the only way to survive is to make sure everyone survives. That's not just human nature. That's what people become when they refuse to let the darkness win."